Hello, and welcome to the Never Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson. I am going to be talking today about matriarchy and feminism. This is a subject that I went over in my last season, but I actually was focused on patriarchy. And it's definitely a subject that's there's so much to say about it, so much to talk about. And I just wanted to delve into that again, but from the other side. And I did talk about matriarchy in that. I just went over my episode from the last season. And I have to say, I've been really impressed and really happy with the people that are bringing up the subject of matriarchy and really trying to get into some of the details about what that means. And I took a course on this subject last year as well, on specifically the matriarchal cultures of ancient Europe, which is not an easy subject to look at because so much has been destroyed and it is quite far away in the past. So you're piecing together a lot of little things about culture and archaeology and so on. Um, but I'm glad people are talking about it because I definitely feel that there's a lot of lies about the subject. Part of the way patriarchy has taken over matriarchal or egalitarian cultures has been through lying and destroying evidence and destroying physically all of the knowledge and awareness and motifs of the matriarchal cultures. So, of course, it's going to be hard to find that evidence if it has been purposefully destroyed. And that's often one of the mainstays of the patriarchal mindset, is to actually completely get rid of all of the matriarchal cultures before. So, the ways that that's happened has been numerous, and it's happened all over the world. I mean, most of the major religions are basically stories about patriarchy taking over matriarchy. And I think there's evidence to show, too, that what we think of as our human culture was starting before we were really human. And I've had some little intuitions about that, and there's some evidence of that, that a lot of what we think of as being human is having our big brains and being smart. But if you really look into it, I think there's a lot of evidence showing that actually we're not following that. What we seem to have become is really, really just tool makers, more than being intelligent, and especially more than being wise. I think we've actually lost a lot of wisdom in our culture. The way I see our culture now, the way I see the world now, is fractured patriarchy. So I don't like saying the patriarchy because I just don't see it as a unit, even though it is kind of a unified force. The fact is that patriarchies tend to fight each other all the time. War is one of the mainstays of patriarchy. But I think what I'm seeing today, online especially, is women mostly who are mistaking matriarchy for just women ruling and women sort of being their own group. So that's where I have to part ways with this mentality. There's no evidence that matriarchal cultures were women only. That's a totally different concept. So there was definitely gender segregation in matriarchy. I should use the present tense because we do have matriarchal cultures here on Earth still that are functioning. And if we actually look at those matriarchal cultures, which I really wish people would do more, if you're going to go online and start talking about matriarchy, at least do a little bit of research and actually look up real matriarchal cultures. I looked it up. I've looked it up a few times. I'm not an expert, but the ones that I'm familiar with more are like Navajo, a lot of the Dene cultures that they are connected to, Iroquois, also known as the Haudenosaunee. They are matriarchal cultures to this day. The Mosuo in China. I was looking up some others in India. they are functional and they exist today. And if you want to talk about matriarchy, please look them up. The archaeological evidence for past matriarchies is really, really interesting and compelling. However, you still have to take that with a grain of salt that with time and with retelling their old stories that we have a different version of what they were actually living. But what I'm putting together when you're looking at this ancient history is that there probably was a time where it was very matriarchal in the sense that women were in major positions of leadership. There are stories of cultures where there were always queens. Now, there's definitely evidence that there's a huge number of cultures that were more egalitarian. So moving away from this sort of pure matriarchy into something that's a lot more balanced and changeable, and we have to remember that when we're talking about things like matriarchy and patriarchy, they are things that we have put together that are still within the context of an entire culture, often with a lot of other aspects to their culture that maybe don't have as much to do with gender. And I think it's important to understand that there are a lot of different distinctions and also levels of how these things play out. And that's why I call today like fractured patriarchy, because it's not really cohesive. And when you look at how actual people behave, when they behave sort of in a free society where they're kind of allowed to do what they want, people will often revert into a matriarchal type of family system because that's just what's more natural, because we're mammals. And that's what I went over before when I was talking about patriarchy, and that is that the reason patriarchy is wrong is for the simple reason that fathers are not more important than mothers. And that's another big distinction that I want to talk about a little bit, is the distinction between male dominance and patriarchy, and the distinction, as I mentioned, between the female dominance in political systems versus the matriarchal system. Because there's female and then there's mothers, right? There's males and then there's fathers. Matriarchy and patriarchy specifically refer to mothers and fathers. So mostly what that's about is the family system. It doesn't necessarily mean how the higher governmental system works. So those are important distinctions, because you will find cultures with a bunch of different aspects of these different cultural systems. The other mistake with what people talk about matriarchy is they seem to just be applying the latest leftist kind of propaganda as though that's matriarchy. And that's very, very different. Like a lot of the ideas that you'll find in a matriarchal culture may not even make a lot of sense according to the current political climate and the kind of things that are on the table. The overall thing that is common that most people get right is that the nurturing aspect of what women need to be in order to be mothers is given more importance in a matriarchal culture that influences everyone, especially the men. So the men in a matriarchal culture will be taught to be kinder, to be gentler, to be more generous, to do all of the things that are actually what we would stereotypically consider to be feminine, right? Because femininity itself in a matriarchy will be respected more so than in a patriarchy. So that's one of those ironic things, is that patriarchy is actually the original gender role reversal. And, it's been rolling around in my head for a while, but feminism, as we talk about it now, has gone through a bunch of different waves in a very short period of time. I mean, as far as human history goes, maybe not in terms of our lifetime, but, the last 150 years, when you look at the whole timeline of humanity, as I said, we're looking at matriarchy that was in control of humanity probably from the time that we became hominids and slowly started evolving into Homo sapiens. And this is a theory that I'm working on, not in my next book and the one after that, which is that patriarchy is essentially causing brain damage and shrinking the human brain. That's the theory. And so on the converse, the other side of that theory is basically that the reason that we got bigger brained and more cultural is precisely because matriarchy was in charge. And so in the matriarchal system, in the matriarchal spiritual worldview, that's actually upholding the natural order. That's actually upholding reality. It's upholding how things actually are. And patriarchy is like severe brain damage. The mental illness aspect of patriarchy, I think, is extremely significant. And I think there's evidence to show that patriarchy is what has made our brains start shrinking again, which has been happening for 10,000 years and has increased in the last 4,000 years. I mean, every aspect of what that patriarchal mentality is now getting so much starker. And I think people don't recognize it because it's no longer really about male and female, because it really is more about the sky versus earth. And that's the religious aspect of patriarchy that has come out of it. Originally, in most of the old religions, it's a masculine aspect to the divine, and then there's the feminine aspect to the divine. And often they are closely connected to the sky and the earth. And that the male part is in the sky, the female part is in the earth. So you've got these divisions, but it's all equal. It's like, this is how we balance each other out. This is how not just society, but like in a way, these dichotomies of being exist, and then we just happen to represent that by being in this binary sex in humanity, which is of course not that clear cut. Even the moon and the sun, the sun is considered to be masculine. We're revolving around the sun, and the moon is considered to be feminine, and the moon is revolving around the earth. And those kind of things, those are really, really ancient cosmological associations that the moon and motherhood and women has been long, 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 long connected, because we have our period every month. It's like an obvious, obvious connection. So something like Islam that totally destroys the female cosmology by taking over the lunar symbolism is really about destroying the matriarchal order that was the natural order, that was what made sense to us biologically and also within the actual cosmology. So the reason we need to get a hold of what matriarchy is because we need to mainstream it, and we need to get it into that globalized culture as a way to get back to our biological origins, as a way to heal the fracture of these misaligned roles of mother and father in patriarchy. The other reasons why is the psychology. There's a psychological implication of that. There are a lot of really interesting people right now that are talking about that, and I actually find it really interesting that I've noticed a lot of the men who are talking about patriarchy right now and trying to rectify that are actually getting really more into the emotional aspect of that. And I think that's so important, because for men, especially in a patriarchy who are taught so much toxic masculinity, the best way out of that patriarchal mentality is really a feeling role and to understand emotion. For women in patriarchy, we've been shoved into the most hyper feminine stereotype of what we're supposed to be, which is we're the only ones that are supposed to feel, and we're supposed to feel all the time, and we're not supposed to be intellectual, and we're not supposed to be physical, and we're not supposed to be competitive, and we're not supposed to have a public life. So women have like taken that in and like shriveled up in all of this emotion and all of this psychological manipulation. And I think the best thing for women coming out of a patriarchy is actually to get really, really practical and really aware of their physical health, because reproductive physical health is the number one thing that patriarchal societies will attack. And we see this happening directly right now in the United States. We saw it happen in Russia. They just keep repeating the same pattern over and over and over again, is that they will attack the well-being and the health of women and women's reproductive knowledge as a way to shut down the matriarchal system. And so for women, I think that that is crucial. And that's where contemporary feminism has gone way wrong. We are so far off track. Like, it just breaks my heart how far off track so many women are right now with feminism. And it's a number of different things. Like I said, it's this idea of like pretending that matriarchy is like a gender segregated female world, which is so wrong. Men benefit so much from matriarchy because it doesn't push them into a role that's unnatural. The father-son obsession in patriarchy is unbelievable, and yet it doesn't make sense biologically, because biologically, men actually inherit more from their mother than from their fathers. So the mother-son connection and the mother-daughter connection and the father-daughter connection, where the father also passes more of his genes on to his daughter than his son. All of those parent-child relationships are more important than father to son. What's convenient about father to son is that the Y chromosome stays fairly stable and usually is passed down as a whole, so it's easy to follow and find out patrilineal heritage through the Y chromosome. And then you can do the same thing also with the matrilineal descent from the mitochondrial DNA. So if you just look at society and how many men are obsessed with the father-son role, and yet so many fathers left their families. So many fathers leave their children. So how can we have a patriarchal culture if men don't even follow it? And that's the thing that a lot of women don't understand, is that the men that are doing that are actually following more of a matriarchal order. Because in a matriarchal society, the man wouldn't have as much control over his own children. But a man leaving after he's gotten a woman pregnant or had a baby isn't the end of the world in a matriarchal culture. It's only the end of the world for a woman in a patriarchal culture. So that's another way that sometimes women are actually really feeding patriarchal mentality by not understanding the difference. Now, that's not to say that matriarchal cultures don't have marriage and the relationships are important. If anything, relationships are more important. What's not as important is this sexual monogamy, right? Most matriarchal cultures are a lot more liberal and open. Premarital sex is not frowned upon. That's another thing I talked about before too, is exogamy is mostly the norm in matriarchal cultures. What is consistent is that you look at it from a biological perspective, what you see very clearly is that matrilineal descent should be number one. So that's matrilineal. That's the aspect of matriarchal society where the name or the clan or whatever is passed on through the mother. So today, if we were to mainstream matriarchy, what we would have is that all of our last names would be our mother's last name. So we would have the matronymic system. We would not have the patronymic system like we have now. The idea of women changing their names to their husband's name after they get married would be just like outrageously wrong. Like, as far as I'm concerned, that is the most anti-feminist thing that anybody could ever do, is to change their last name to their husband's after getting married. Like, that is your lineage. That is your background. You haven't changed your lineage or your ancestry by getting married. So don't change your last name. So mainstream matriarchy would mean women would never change their last name. They wouldn't even think of it. And they would pass on their last name to their children. Now, the whole idea of last names is a fairly recent invention, and that's why I'm saying this would be the globalized mainstream matriarchy. That's what that would look like. I don't see any other way for that to happen. So the other thing that would have to happen to have like a better system now, so matrilineal is one of them. Exogamy is a big one. So exogamy is essentially that you marry someone outside of your culture and ethnic group. Now that makes so much sense from a genetic perspective, from a biological perspective, but also from a social perspective. We can see clearly, very clearly over and over again that patriarchal takeover uses certain aspects of the more pacifist matriarchal cultures. Now, part of that is the tolerance paradox, which is that when you are so tolerant, you will tolerate intolerant people, and so you will end up creating more intolerance because you haven't recognized that these other people are actually being more intolerant, and so they're actually attacking your perspective. You know, and the same thing goes for kindness. It's like, and you've heard some pretty dark stories about places where people were starving to death and started to cannibalize, and they said the pacifists who refused to hurt anyone got eaten first. It's dark, but unfortunately there is a truth to that. If you were so focused on being pacifist and tolerant and kind, often you will get attacked. So in order to survive in this world, we need an element of self-defense in order to be able to recognize when you're getting taken advantage of precisely for being so kind and tolerant, and that other people don't actually agree with you that they should be tolerant, and so that they won't tolerate you even though you're tolerating them. And that happens a lot. And so this is one of the weak points of matriarchy, which is why I believe a lot of matriarchies were taken over. Partially it's because of that kindness. The other thing is the gender segregation. So when you gender segregate, when a patriarchal culture comes into contact with a matriarchal culture that has gender segregation, that makes it so much easier for patriarchy to take over, because the patriarchal culture will use that gender segregation to turn the men away from the women, to say, why are you letting these women tell you what to do? Why are you letting them have so much power? Look at us, we're so powerful, we're so violent, we took over all these other societies, we kicked them out, we took over, we have this empire, we're so powerful, we're so strong. Don't you want to be powerful and strong like us? Then you have to keep your woman down, and you have to control your children, and you have to implement this violent structure in order to be powerful and strong like us. That's the argument of patriarchy, that they will always give men when they are segregated from women. So the worst thing that you could do as a woman to try to implement matriarchy is to gender segregate. That's the worst thing you could do. We absolutely require matriarchal men, and men who understand why matriarchy is better from a rational perspective. And it's not that hard, because men don't lose in a matriarchy. They really don't lose that much at all. And to come back to the idea of the family structure versus the governmental structure. So a lot of the matriarchal cultures, and we can use the Haudenosaunee as an example, if you go back in time when the Europeans started arriving, imagine a democracy where only men run for power. Okay, we can imagine that. That's happened for a lot of history. But only the women voted. So the women actually controlled which chiefs came into power. So they were the ones making the decisions. And this comes down to the basics of why there are gender roles to start with, which is biology, right? Women who are going to be giving birth and nursing and taking care of small children have less energy to give anything else. Because if they want those children to survive, they have to withdraw from certain other activities, like taking over the government. So from that sort of rational perspective, you can see how that would make some sense. That the men are still making these decisions in power, but they're recognizing that their obligation is still to women. So like, you're taking this role, I understand what a big deal it is, so I'm going to take this role, but I'll make sure that I'm doing it to make sure that you are being taken care of. So that system, now some of the criticisms that Europeans had about that culture was that the women did so much work. So even though they weren't even in the government, they were still doing a lot of work, because when you have a matriarchal culture and the mothers have that much power, responsibility, work, all go together. So the role of mother is a very labor-intensive role. And I think this is the other big point that I want to make in general, is like, so much of feminism is just a reaction to patriarchy. It's not matriarchy, and it's not even egalitarian. Unfortunately, there is a lot of misandry in a lot of feminism. I tend to avoid I avoid gender segregated groups, and I've noticed a lot when women have these groups where they all get together, they really do just complain about men a lot. And they do confuse the idea of men and patriarchy as two separate things. So we need to understand the difference. There's men, there's patriarchy, there's male dominance in the government. Those are all separate things. So if we want to create a better future What we need is egalitarianism, and egalitarianism is better and more important than anything else, whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's culture, because abuse is really, really the mainstay of how patriarchy took over, is by bringing that male dominance into the family structure rather than only having it in the governmental structure. But a true egalitarian system would not have that dominance, not in the government, not in the home, right? So fathers do need to be important. We do need a little bit of that patriarchy to acknowledge that fathers are important. I don't believe in a pure matriarchy. I don't think that it should be only women in charge of the children. I think that men do need to play a role. But that's an egalitarian perspective. That's not necessarily a matriarchal perspective, right? But remember that matriarchy always focuses on harmony and peace between the relationships with people. So relationships within the group are so important in matriarchy. So that's something that we need to take with us. So the focus on peace and harmony, the matrilineal naming systems, egalitarianism in different aspects of life, like these are the things we need to take from the different levels of culture that we have had in the past. And most of what's patriarchy can be thrown out, honestly, except for we are so steeped in it and we don't really know what it is. So I hear a lot of people claiming that some things are patriarchal, but they did exist in matriarchal cultures too. Things like hierarchy. There was hierarchy in matriarchal cultures. There has been hierarchy in matriarchal cultures. It just isn't necessarily violent, especially intergroup violence. So it's really the idea of like that within your tribe or your family or community, no violence is accepted, right? None. When you go into war with another group, that's a different story. So that's a different mentality. And I think that's where the violent cultures that were very violent within their culture, not just with other groups, but within the family structure, where actually children are encouraged to be violent. And you cannot be a woman in that kind of patriarchal culture and not become violent yourself. It's inevitable. So this violent, angry woman is just a natural outcome of a reaction to patriarchy. So a lot of the feminist stereotype comes directly from the patriarchal narrative. That's the success of patriarchy, is that it has forced women to become men, because it has forced women to defend themselves against violence, because that's the only way they're going to survive. And they often become very abusive, controlling, and violent mothers too. And then men, a lot of men are still celebrated because they have gotten so much privilege and they have been treated so much better that they have become kind of better people. Like they become the kind of good men that are able to actually just be the basic level of decent, become extraordinary because they have been allowed to. So you see a lot of like really, really traumatized women coming out of this patriarchal culture, and the men seem to be fine. But that's why. So what that means, this kind, loving, doting father is a mother. That's what patriarchy has done. It's given us mother-like fathers and father-like mothers, because it's not acknowledging the natural order that a mother who has given her whole body to her children needs to be in control of that role. And no man should be controlling that. He can participate in the well-being of his children. But I think why people don't get that is because women are so deeply patriarchal still that they don't even know what a naturally matriarchal mother even is, because there are so few. So there's a lot of things that we need to do. We need to, please, if you talk about matriarchy online, just look it up. Just Google it. Google actual matriarchal cultures. Google a little bit about the history. There are a lot of matriarchal cultures that you can analyze and you can look at and you can read about that will show you what I'm saying. Because so many of them are tribal now, that's what's so confusing. And I think that's where we need to make a leap between what the tribes were doing, which is very distinct to them and often involves a lot of really like old rituals that we can't just apply elsewhere. But the basis of being like peaceful and kind to each other and completely being just totally intolerant of any kind of domestic violence and any kind of rape or incest, like if we make sure that those specific items are addressed first and foremost as a priority, then a lot of the other positive aspects of matriarchal and egalitarian cultures are going to come together. Like, and we've already seen that. I mean, beating children is way less acceptable now than it was a generation ago, and that's one of those very directly patriarchal things that happens. So there's a lot on the table to look at. I'm just so happy that people are talking about it. And, even if you're someone who disagrees with me, like, I just hope that you'll just sort of listen to me and just be open. So, no, women-only groups are not the answer to patriarchy. I understand where that argument comes from. I was reading Caliban and the Witch this last year, which is a really interesting book about a lot of the serf system in Europe and about how capitalism and patriarchy work together to take over the more matriarchal cultures that were there in Europe before. And there was this idea about gossip being something that patriarchy always attacks. Now, there is an element of truth to that. If you look at Afghanistan now, the men in power have shut down women's ability to communicate with each other, often because when women communicate with each other, it is, in some cases, especially in a patriarchal system, as a way to help each other get away from abusive men. And that's so important. Like, I'm not suggesting that that can't happen, but the idea that gossip in general is just about protecting women from abusive men is just not true. A lot of the time, women use gossip to attack other women. And that's something that you really have to be aware of. And that's also one of the reasons why women-only groups are a really bad idea, especially because you have no idea how patriarchal some of those women would be. And because we have choice feminism now, where you can be fully patriarchal and still call yourself a feminist, and hearing people saying that they're pro-gossip now as though it's a feminist idea, in this age of the digital era, like, we're not in a tribe, we're not in the medieval era. And if that is a reaction to patriarchy, you do not want to align yourself with a reaction to patriarchy. You want to align yourself with a functional, egalitarian system. The thing that you have to realize when you have a theory like that it is just a theory, you have to be careful about how you actually implement that. Because if women are now focused on women-only groups where they gossip all the time, and they start criticizing the women who still like men, we're getting nowhere. Because you have to remember, if you avoid men and you kick them out and you exclude them, they are going to gossip about you. And that gossip that you are promoting is going to be even worse on the male side. And men as a group and women as a group, if we clash, if we fight, the men are going to win. So think about it. Keep an eye on the men. Make sure you don't exclude men. Make sure you don't exclude anybody. We need men in the matriarchal system, and we need egalitarianism globally. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It was a lot to talk about. It's been rattling in my head. I think this issue has kind of just taken on bigger and bigger importance, and I wish more people would talk about it. I really want to see egalitarianism become mainstream. I want to see people really wake up and understand that patriarchy isn't going to give them or anybody what we need in order to have a good culture and a species that can actually survive. So no, matriarchy isn't going to solve all of our problems, but it will bring us to a place of egalitarianism where we can get better at solving those problems. Thanks for joining me. This has been Kim Anderson, and this is The Never Ending Experiment. See you later.